Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art. Today we're going to be making a Batik Style Ceramic Tile. Hot damn. So for this project, the materials that you will need are a ceramic tile. So you can have bone dry clay or bisque-fired clay will work well. We've got some cold wax here. Traditionally, Batik is done with hot wax, but because you might be doing this with younger students, the cold wax is a much safer alternative. So I've just dispersed a little bit of cold wax into a container because it does come in quite large amounts, but you will only need a small amount per child to do this activity. And we also have some watercolor paints, which we will use later on to color over the Batik wax. So the project that we're going to work on is a pattern or design work. Depending on what theme or activity you want to do with your students, you can alter it to suit that theme. So the reason that you might want to use Batik wax for a ceramic piece instead of a traditional textiles piece is because you could use it on any form of clay. So if you didn't have a kiln, this could be a great way to decorate a clay project, and because the Batik style does lend itself quite well to different pattern work. So something similar you could do with paper would be an oil pastel resist. So to get started with your first piece, again, we're just doing a really simple silhouette, good for younger kids, is to have your cold wax in a very small brush. The smaller the brush, the better, because you'll have a lot more control. Also, if you're working on bigger tiles, it might be good for the younger kids because they have more area to work with. Now, when you apply the cold wax, you can see it's quite thick when you first put it on the tile. You need it to be quite thick so you can remove it after you have put the watercolors on. So the thicker the better with this. It might take a little while to dry, but it is better if you do apply it nice and thick. Now, when you are thinking of a design or the students are drafting their designs, it's much better to not draw directly onto the ceramic tile. That's just because once you put the wax on and removed it, you will see the lines coming from underneath. So once this wax is dry, right now it looks like a bit of a PVA consistency and it's white, it will dry completely clear. So anything you draw underneath the tile, you will see the lines coming through. But then again, if you wanted to do some line work before you apply the wax, that might create an interesting effect on the tile as well. So now I'm just going to complete the first design and then I will talk to you later. Is that all right? So when you're using the cold wax and you're with students who are a bit unsure of their painting skills or abilities and they're a bit scared of making a mistake, you can just use a tissue to wipe away any areas that you think you might have made a mistake on or that they want to fix up a line. You can also just make a barrier with the wax around the edges. So instead of painting over the whole area with wax, you might just want to do a dull line around the edge, and then the kids can fill in the area with the wax. So now that we've got our first little picture done, so this would be a really good activity for the younger students, even grade 2 upwards. Would be nice to do something like this with big, bold lines so that the kids can easily navigate the small brush and the wax, but it is just like a painting activity. So if your kids have decent skills in painting, then they'll definitely be able to complete something like this. Now, if you wanted to get a little bit more complicated, the next thing we will do is some smaller line work with some patterns for our next tile. So something like this, maybe grade 4 upwards, but you can make it as complicated or as simple as you like. And again, if you're using bigger tiles, then your kids will be able to navigate them a bit more easily than having to work on a smaller piece of tile. Okay. So now the next one we'll do is more of just a tribal kind of pattern. So you could link this to different cultures if you wanted to, or just stick to different line and pattern work with the students. So when you're creating little dot patterns, it's very easy to do, especially with a small brush. If you just dab a little bit of the wax on, you can make the dots as big or as small as you like, depending on how much pressure you put down on the brush and depending on how much wax is on your brush as well. But definitely dots and lines are very easy to do with this style of work. Now we've finished this tile, and as you can see there's much more line work involved in this, and there are much finer lines and more details. So again, your middle range students would be fine doing something like this. And then for when we're actually adding the colour, we can section off the colours in this as well, instead of overlaying just one whole colour over the top of the tile. Now we'll move on to the next one. So the next tile that we'll do will be more dot type work, and the interest in this next tile will be more in the colours that we add over the top, but for now it's just a very similar technique to the first two. So when you're working on a design like this, it's good for the kids to know to work from one end to the other end. This is just so you don't put your hand into the wax, which will smudge everywhere. But if they do that, then just wipe it away with a cloth. And just make sure you get as much wax as you can off the tile, just so it doesn't resist the watercolour when you are applying it once it's dry. So now that I've finished this tile, you can see there's more of a dot technique within this, which is much easier to apply than lines. So if you find your kids are struggling with line work, then you might want to guide them towards doing more dot patterns, which is much easier with a brush, especially using the wax like we are today. Now I'm going to put these aside, and just like any good cooking show, here are some tiles that I've prepared earlier. So very, very similar, not exactly the same, because, well, when do you ever make something that looks exactly the same twice? Not me, ever. But again, the same techniques, similar shapes, similar patterns. What you will notice between these two different tiles is that these have been painted about an hour beforehand, and this one is still quite wet, but you can see around the edges it is starting to dry out. Now with your bisque-fired clay, you won't have to wait as long with a bone dry clay for these to start to dry, but you will probably have to leave a lesson in between for them to actually become workable. So these have been sitting for about an hour and a half, and you can see they are still slightly wet in some areas, especially where the wax has been applied very thick, but they will still be easy enough to work on top of. You just might have to be a bit more gentle. So we'll start with the lizard tile first. So with this one, we'll just do really simple colour blending around the lizard. It's best not to paint directly on top of the wax. This is just because it will save you using watercolours, it'll save you time, and because you don't want to accidentally knock off the wax or to scrape it off when you are brushing the watercolour over the top. But if there is some overlay, it won't affect how the wax will come off, and you'll still get that same pattern underneath that you applied with the wax. So now with these watercolours, I'm just going to do some blue and green tones for this one, because it'll contrast quite nicely to the terracotta clay, which has that orangey brown look. So these work best when you apply quite a bit of water with the watercolour, just to pick up enough of those pigments to cover that clay. So I'm going to use a few different tones of green and blue, just so it creates some interest with the different tones mixing together, so it's not all just one flat colour. Now when you are applying these, you do want to try and go around the wax as much as possible. If there's some overlap, that's completely fine, but it will make your life a bit easier when you are removing the wax, just to go around with the watercolour instead of straight over the top. So to get some nice marbled looks and some nice colour blending, you can always add some more water over the top. You can see that's making some interesting shapes in those watercolours. Now we've finished painting over our lizard, and as you can see the watercolour's quite wet from where we've just finished painting, but where we started it's already starting to dry out. Again, because it is on a bisque-fired tile, it just absorbs most of that moisture, so you shouldn't have to wait too long for it to dry, but we will put that to the side and start painting our next tile. So with this one, the tribal kind of look, what I'm going to do is just section off the colours instead of mixing them and blending them all together, because we've got some nice shapes here. We're just going to paint in those sections, which is something that you can definitely do with the students as well if you wanted to talk about the elements of colour in this work. So as you can see, the lines and dots in these are much finer. So what you might find is that the students colour over those little intricate designs because they are much easier to colour over than colour around. But what you can do is, once it's dry, is scrape off the excess wax, which will show those patterns underneath. So if you are painting your tile and you notice that some areas are not taking on the watercolour, it might be because the students have rubbed away some wax and it hasn't completely gone off the tile. If you just use a toothpick or even the back of your brush, you can remove that excess wax and then the watercolour should stay onto the tile once it's painted. Now that we've finished our second tile, you notice that the lines are a little bit more messy on this one, partly because there was some excess wax left on there, which I might have made a mistake on this one and rubbed it out, which your kids might do as well, and partly because the lines are a bit thinner, so they're harder to paint around. So don't worry too much if you are looking at your work and you've got some watercolour where it shouldn't be, because the next step will be to remove the wax from this. But we still have our third tile to create. So with this one, what we're going to do is paint around these patterns. So with these, it has a bit of a flower and a leaf shape, so I'm going to paint a different colour around these flower shapes to what I would with these leaf shapes to suggest those forms in the line work as well. When you are working with dry watercolour sets, it's important to use quite a bit of water to activate them. So if the students keep dipping their brush in the palettes just to make sure that they can pick up enough of that pigment to work with, otherwise the watercolours do look like they're not really having enough coverage. So just make sure that you keep dipping your brush in the water to activate the dry watercolours. Now we're back with our tiles, so we've let the watercolour dry over the space of about 15 to 20 minutes, and now what we can do is use these scratch tools. So these are just little wooden sticks, or even toothpicks will work, to remove the excess wax that we don't need. So you could leave the wax on if you don't have any watercolour going over the top, but if you did want to remove it just to clean up the lines, then you simply just work over the top. And as you can see, some of the wax is still a little bit wet, just noticing how white it is compared to the rest of it, but that's fine. It shouldn't really affect the work too much. It's just a little bit more sticky when you remove it compared to the wax that's dry, like this one over here. So just using a tissue to get rid of some of the extra wax there. And like I said before, you can just leave the wax on, but if you did want to teach the kids how to remove the wax, then this is definitely an easy option. Now that I've removed some of the wax that was overlapping with the watercolour, I have left quite a bit of it on because it doesn't really take away from the colour underneath. It's not really very noticeable, so you can just remove some of the wax and leave some on. Whereas with the other ones that have quite thin lines, you might want to remove all that wax. So we'll start with this other one and hopefully those lines underneath become a bit more crisp. Now that we've finished our 3 different tiles, you can see they're all quite different and well suited to varying ability levels depending on who you're working with. So we've got our nice marbled background with the watercolours, and we've got our little tribal pattern, and now we've got our flowers which are defined with the watercolours surrounding the patterns, as well as those wax shapes that we've got in the middle. So this is quite a nice easy activity, really great idea if you don't have a kiln to fire ceramics in and you want to decorate them in an interesting way. Also really nice if you don't want to do batik on fabric, this is a much easier alternative as well. That's it for now, we'll see you next time.